As mentioned, within the elaboration likelihood model, there are two primary routes to persuasion that the theory has hypothesized. These are the central route and the peripheral route. So let me start with the central route. The first example I showed of the very detailed fact sheet with citations and connections to peer-reviewed literature is something you would process using the central route, where the quality of information is what is key. People who want to process information using the central route, or are more likely to process information, are going to focus on the message arguments. These message arguments help develop a new understanding, or will integrate with the information. They will integrate the information with prior knowledge. So attitudes formed via this route are usually rational because we've spent time really processing and considering the information and comparing it to what we already knew and storing it away. So people pay attention to the message and make a cognitive effort to interpret the message and evaluate it. It may not be completely rational. There are some other factors that may intervene where pre-existing opinions about the value of the message arguments could come in, where if we already had pre-existing opinions about a source, that might influence our rationalization of the information. But as you can tell, this route is really emphasizing taking more time and care when processing information. But let's be real, we can't always do this. So that's where the peripheral route comes in. So when people process information using this route, there's less careful consideration of the message arguments. They're not spending time reading it, highlighting it, annotating it, storing it away. In fact, we are in this route emphasizing peripheral cues. So these are cues that you can see work as cognitive shortcuts. So we don't have to carefully consider the message. A logo, a particular source, a pretty picture, all of these characteristics or factors don't require a lot of cognitive effort. So we can say, oh, that's from the USDA, I trust them, moving on, or whatever the case may be. So in agricultural communications, I want you to consider which route to persuasion is more effective. And I hope you're going to say, well, it depends. It depends on who we're trying to reach and what the topic is and what people already know about it and what they want to learn about it. And you're right. So for consumers or those who are in the industry, there's a lot of personal factors that might influence which route to persuasion they might take. So we're going to talk through some of these particular concepts. To give you just a quick look at how these concepts all work together as we start to break them into more detail, I do have this figure and this process model of how someone might be exposed to persuasive information. And then depending on if they're motivated to process the information, what route to persuasion they might take. So this will be in the notes, and you can always pause the video to study this in more detail. But this framework does demonstrate those two routes to persuasion, and it highlights that you need to have motivation and ability in order to work through this model. But there are a number of constructs that start to appear, and I'm going to highlight just a few of these. So the first one is issue involvement, and this is really related to your motivation. So this influences the amount of importance that we give to a persuasive message. If it's an issue that is not personally pertinent to you, maybe it's in a different state or a different commodity, a different university, you may not be that highly motivated to consider the information. So the strength of involvement influences your ability as well, because it's influences whether you want to think more in support or against the argument. If you're not involved in the issue, you may not even want to expend any energy. So sometimes I think about elections. If it's not an election in your state and you can't vote, you may not be as motivated or able to process information to come to some sort of decision because there's probably other issues in your own state that you need to pay attention to. So within issue involvement, you can classify people as low or high. And so according to this theory, an individual, if they're low involvement, will focus less cognitive effort, and they'll focus more on the peripheral cues. Source credibility could be a peripheral cue if it's something that they know and recognize. Then, if they're highly involved, you can use counter arguments. And these counter arguments, people might actually argue against them, and it could lead to adverse thoughts or decreased agreement if that's your tact. Arguments in agreement will produce corresponding thoughts. You're like, oh yes, I agree with that. That's what I've always thought, and support the argument. Another concept or variable is personal relevance, and this influences what message attributes contribute to its effectiveness. This is close to issue involvement, but there may be issues that you're somewhat involved in, but they're maybe not as personally relevant to you as others. So it's a nuanced difference. But when issues are of low relevance, or topics are of low relevance, you're not as motivated to expend energy. And then peripheral cues are going to be what you would need if you know that people are going to think that this is not as relevant to them. Whereas if it's highly relevant to your audience, then you're going to expend some mental effort, and you'll probably dedicate cognitive effort to develop knowledge and opinions. And the logic of message arguments is going to be really important. And again, this is where in agriculture, sometimes it's difficult because people aren't as involved and may not view the relevance of the information. So trying to talk to them about complicated topics that are nuanced and have a lot of different perspectives can be challenging because they're not motivated to really pay attention and consider that information. Another personal factor that can influence which route to persuasion someone might take is just our own innate curiosity, our need for cognition. How much do we enjoy thinking and considering new information and being exposed to new ideas? So this need for cognition can influence the persistence and resistance of newly formed or changed attitudes. If people this is a motivating factor because it can influence which persuasion route. So people who have higher need for cognition, I hope you could guess, are going to be more on the central route to persuasion because they want to think about it. And then those who don't are going to be more on the peripheral route. So again, this slide helps demonstrate that if you have a low need for cognition, you're not going to carefully evaluate the quality of the information compared to if you did. The great thing about this is that if we can motivate people to think more about the information and consider the quality of the information, once they have come to a decision, that decision is more persistent, probably because they've invested the time and the energy to form it, and they don't want every little thing to question it. Another concept is argument quality. And this is really where message design comes in. So this addresses the characteristics of the persuasive message. And that could, contain a number of different attributes. And this feature of a persuasive message can influence the resulting thoughts. So in research, we often see messages manipulated to be either strong or weak in their message arguments in order to evaluate who is responding to each type of message, and perhaps even manipulate other factors in the experimental design. So argument quality can be assessed and measured in a number of ways. So depending on which route to persuasion someone might be more inclined, it really influences what they're evaluating in terms of argument quality. So in the peripheral route, we know that people aren't going to spend a lot of time, so they do not understand the message arguments or maybe there's no arguments in there at all. They're just relying on other peripheral cues. So they develop thoughts about the issue based on the quality of the arguments in alignment with their pre-existing attitudes. So you can see here the difference. So just basically, what did they already think about the topic in terms of their attitudes? That will be influenced by what they pay attention to in the message and how much attention they give to the message. The central route, as you have heard, requires the message recipient to pay more attention and attempt to understand the message and even evaluate them. So if the message has strong and effective arguments, ideally, thinking more about it will lead to more favorable thoughts and a lasting persuasion. But if message arguments are perceived as weak, additional thought will lead to counter arguments. People will start to say, well, this is why that's not true. So in this week's reading, they talked about argument quality in terms of how they manipulated the messages. So they manipulated them in terms of complexity, as simple or complex, or the message-sidedness as one or two-sided arguments. I encourage you to read that article to see how they used ELM to design the messages and then test them in relation to other personal characteristics of their audience. So ELM can be applied in a number of consumer research areas by looking at what we can do before a message is presented to someone, such as how many times they've heard it, what they already know about it, does it relate to them, what types of media we're using to share the information. We can also use it to design those messages and look at processing cues, meaning what content do we have? Are we making comparisons? Are we including visuals? And then manipulating the source. So these are just examples from other studies that have used ELM to show the variety of concepts and areas that you can test using this approach. So for your second discussion board topic this week, I want you to refer to this article about developing effective messages regarding potable recycled water, and drawing upon what you learned from that article and this lecture, select another topic in agriculture or natural resources that requires some persuasive communication. So what is that topic, and what factors might influence how people process information about it? Go back and look at some of those factors in the ELM framework. And then tell me just briefly, how could you use ELM to design messages that could achieve a specific change in attitude or behavior regarding that topic? If you're stumped on this question, use Google Scholar and look for other research on ELM, and you'll find a lot of applications of this in terms of changing people's attitudes and behaviors. So in review, this is the main hypothesis of ELM regarding the amount and type of thinking that one does in regard to a persuasive message. We know that motivation and ability are important factors to consider when we're designing messages and trying to predict what route to persuasion someone might take. Here are some of those key variables that you could mention in your discussion post and are highlighted more in the video. There are 2 routes to persuasion, as we've identified, and the constructs that can be applied in a number of ways to develop messages and in a number of persuasive communication contexts.